Well, I couldn't agree more. I'd like to ask you, what's your opinion about the Iran situation, and how do you think the United States should deal with the Iran problem that's being debated right now?
Well, let's say that there's a spectrum, because it's not a binary question. This, imagine that there's a line, a continuum, where at one end you do nothing at all, and at the other end you have a full scale, Iraq type invasion. Very few people are anywhere near the far end of that line, but along that line there are things you could do in terms of targeting members of the regime financially, in terms of sponsoring internal dissident groups, in terms of backing the democratization program there, or indeed in favor of targeted strikes, no-fly zones and so on. Like I say, apply the principle of reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly. You don't want to be escalating any further than you need to. But I think it would be a mistake, and again, I may disagree with a lot of your listeners here, I think it would be a mistake publicly to state that all of the options are off the table. Mm-hmm. I think you need to be prepared for a modest escalation of pressure so as to avoid a situation where you can actually be dragged into a full-scale war.
Do you think that it should be an option, though, that the United States should be negotiating with Iran and trying to work with them behind the scenes? Because it seems like for many of the Republican GOP contenders that option is kind of off the table.
Well, to be fair, that is what the European Union has been doing for the last 15 years. We have, Iran began really as an EU problem long before it became a U.S. foreign policy issue. For the obvious reason that EU countries are in closer range of any potential missiles. And in the 90s and in the early 2000s, European foreign ministers were all over the Ayatollahs, kissing them and visiting. Our Labour foreign minister, Jack Straw, made, I think, 4 visits to Tehran. So it's not fair to say that hasn't been tried. There was a great effort made to kind of tempt them to jolly them out of their nuclear ambitions, and that failed. Having said that, nor do I think that we're doing nothing at the moment. I don't know, and neither do you, because we're not sitting where we can see all the facts, but plainly there are things that are going on when you look at all these accidents that keep befalling the nuclear technicians in Iran, when you look at Western troops occasionally surfacing in Iranian territory, when you look at some of the internal opposition movements there. So I think things are going on. One of the sad things about the Iraq war, maybe not sad, but one of the game-changing consequences of the Iraq invasion is that we're all much less prepared now to give our government the benefit of the doubt in this kind of situation. So whereas before the Iraq war, most center-right people, whether of a libertarian or a socially conservative bent, would have said, all right, they're the experts, they kind of give them a go. People are much less willing to do that now. It's much harder to know whether there is any effective pressure of the kind that might yield an end to the WMD program. It's not impossible that can work. It worked in Libya. Gaddafi handed over his weapons program. It is possible.
Right. We've lost credibility with the people. We've lost credibility in the world with, when you use power and it's not effective, like it was in Iraq, it's misused and it's not effective, then, the threat of power doesn't carry the same weight.
No, that's right. That's the really critical point, and that's why you don't rush into it. The last war that Britain was involved with that I felt unequivocally supportive of, and I still think we were right, without any conditionality, was the Falklands invasion. I was 11 years old at the time, and that was a straightforward case of a part of our country which was democratic and liberal being invaded by a neighboring fascist tyranny, and we were absolutely right to go in. And if you like, that ticked all the boxes, that we deployed force in earnest and it worked, and since then there hasn't been any threat to the region. It's difficult to find another example of a wholly justifiable conflict.
Well, Daniel, I know you're a big fan of Thomas Jefferson and that you've studied the Declaration of Independence, and I wanted to ask you if you think that the war on drugs is successful, and if you think the federal government has the right to invade people's homes in paramilitary fashion, sometimes killing innocent people, all in the name of stopping people from using drugs?
No, well, no and no is the short answer. It's ineffective, and I think it's unconstitutional. It's a mistake that's being made the world over, to be fair. It's not that the U.S. government is kind of out on a limb. Governments around the world have difficulty accepting reality on this. I was brought up in Peru. I was born in Lima, and I've spent a certain amount of time, in the Andes, where there is an argument, a heavy argument since Evo Morales was elected in Bolivia about the legalization of the growing of coca. By criminalizing the activity, let's just leave aside what's happening in the U.S., just go right back to the root. By criminalizing the activity of the growers, you turn what would otherwise be the most law-abiding and conservative section of the population, which is small farmers, right? I tell you from my constituency, there is no one more interested in property rights and the rule of law than the yeoman farmer, right? You turn him into a brigand by arbitrarily criminalizing the crop that he produces, which in its unrefined form has really remarkably few ill effects on people. So even at that very early stage, you are creating unnecessary chaos in the country of origin. And I think we're doing exactly the same thing, albeit with a different crop, over the poppies in Afghanistan. It seems to me bizarre that we pushed so many growers into the arms of the Taliban by criminalizing their product when they should have been on our side. They should have been the small farmers who were, on the side of law and order and property rights and peace and stability in any other society. That same error is then repeated at every stage of the economic chain that takes you from the little small holding up to the streets of the western cities. You push people into kind of criminal underworld simply by the arbitrary misclassification of what they're doing. It's exactly the same as prohibition. And I'm not saying that it would be a panacea. Look, of course there are, of course there would be some consequences of legalization that would be difficult for people to accept. It would mean that there would be a fall in price and therefore probably an increase in consumption. But plainly, on any sane definition, that is a lesser evil than what we have now.
Yeah, and it would seem to me that people, there is drug use, there's drug abuse right now. It's in the power of gangs. We have our overpopulation of our prison systems, and it seems to me that these types of issues, should be front and center in this, not only the GOP presidential election, but in congressional races as well.
Yeah, I don't think it should be front and center in the GOP presidential race. I really don't think that should be up to the president. I think that should be up to the legislature. There was a brief time in American history, as I understand it, when there really was a kind of a quite serious emphasis on the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, and that was the period of Republican hegemony that followed the Civil War. So the last 30 years of the 19th century. The presidents of that era are pretty forgettable. Let's be honest. The Benjamin Harrisons, the Rutherford B. Hayes, and so on. And yet it was a time when the U.S. went from being a middle-ranking power to being the richest country on earth. There are worse things than having a strong Congress and a weak presidency.
Daniel, in closing, what's your advice to the Republican Party with these two factions, the liberty-minded people from Campaign for Liberty, the Ron Paul people, and the social conservatives? What's your advice to them to bring this together so that everybody can be happy?
Well, first of all, you don't need to argue about things that are not in your power to affect. So the things which are very obviously outside the remit of the presidency are ridiculous issues to fall out about because it doesn't really matter who wins. But on the general issue, I'm basically a libertarian. I sort of tick all of your boxes on drugs and pornography and so on. But I'm also realistic enough to say that these are not the top issues. They're not the definitive questions that we face at a time of economic crisis like this. On the issues that really do matter, parental choice in schools, welfare reform, cutting spending, the conservative and the libertarian are really on the same side. And the reason that we're on the same side in practical terms is because the current dispensation is so far to the left of what either of us would want that 99% of dismantling what's there is something we would agree on. Imagine that you were driving, two cars from New York City to San Francisco, right, to neighboring streets in San Francisco. You would be almost the whole of the journey. You'd be following the same route. It's only at the very last minute that you'd need to worry about diverging. And I think there is a similar point for social conservatives and libertarians. It's crazy to focus on these slightly recondite issues rather than focusing on the immediate threats to the prosperity of our countries, on which we can agree.
Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Hannan is a great force for the cause of liberty, and we recommend that you read his book, The New Road to Serfdom, A Letter of Warning to America. And Daniel Hannan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and opinions with our viewers at freethenation.com.
Great pleasure, Nick.